Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to War Thunder, and here's another video where I'm digging up footage from the archives. Welcome aboard the P-51 H-15NA, and according to the timestamp on the file here, I flew this match way back in February, so enjoy the old sounds, I guess. Now, the Mustangs are some of the most well-known planes of the Second World War. Unfortunately, they're also planes that require a lot of patience and strategic thinking to make the most of. And because of this, you see a lot of new players who make a beeline for the P-51 because they want to reenact Red Tails, but then they try to turn fight Zeros or go head-on against Focke-Wulf 190s and get curb-stomped. As a result, the Mustangs aren't often seen as too much of a threat in my experience, and honestly, most of the time, it's pretty easy to deal with the average Mustang player. But underestimating these machines is a serious mistake at any tier. From the cannon-armed P-51 at 3.7 to the final boss of Mustangs at 6.3, this P-51H, when flown by any competent pilot who knows how to use the strengths of these airframes, the Mustang is definitely worthy of its historical fame. I'll be flying 3 different variants of the Mustang in this video across 3 different nations: the P-51H in the American tree, the J26 in the Swedish tree, and the premium British Mustang Mk IA. Let's start with the P-51. This is the highest battle rating Mustang variant in the game, and for good reason. Its engine performance and speed are nuts. This plane can climb with Griffin Spitfires when fully upgraded, and its insane energy retention and dive speed mean that it's a menace, even against early jets like the Me-262. On the other hand, all of this performance is offset by some very sluggish handling in maneuvers, and because of this, almost anything in the sky will outdo you in a sustained dogfight, as you'll see at the end of this clip. If you're doing it right though, you should never have to get caught up in a dogfight to begin with in this plane, since you can just abuse your altitude advantage and boom and tube until the cows come home. In typical Mustang fashion, the P-51H is armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns with M20 APIT tracer belts, which of course set fires like nobody's business, and when flying against Russian fighters, that makes for quite the show. Well, quite the show when you get your guns on target, that is. In my defense, this was one of my earlier games in this plane, and sometimes this curtain of blinding tracers does make it really hard to figure out whether I'm leaving too far or too little, not to mention that the BI is almost impossible to hit to begin with. Anyway, on with the footage. Now, I should mention that I am playing quite aggressively here, probably too aggressively for my own good, and that philosophy does come to bite me at the end of the game. If I were being really safe, I would have zoomed back out to regain my energy instead of staying low and trying to find new targets just by flat turning on the deck. Thankfully though, the enemy team just disintegrated here, so my gamble paid off for the most part. Though I did lose a few of my squad mates. Speaking of taking risks, there's a sort of paradox in general War Thunder tactics that I have been chewing on for a while now, and it has to do with playing strategically versus getting high kill games. You see, usually we think of players that can rack up a ton of kills as being good at the game, quote unquote, but in reality, if you're actually playing every situation to your advantage and being very conservative with your flying, for example, the way Messerschmitt does, and if you don't know who that is, I'll link his channel in the description because he's definitely one of the best War Thunder players I've ever seen. But if you're very conservative and careful, most of the time, either you end up in a 1v5 because the enemy team shredded yours, or you're left high and dry with no kills because your team shredded the enemy. So in order to get high kill games, you do have to play a bit reckless and take those dangerous risks, even if that means sometimes it comes back to bite you.
Pressure on the enemy. You're winning. The enemy is attacking our base. We must reinforce its defenses.
It was right about here that I was like, yeah, okay, I'm probably screwed. So to reiterate, as a piece of general advice, avoid dogfights when you can when you're in a Mustang, because most of the time that's what happens. The next Mustang in line is the P-51 D20 variant operated by the Swedish Air Force, designated the J26. The P-51D is obviously significantly less powerful than the H in terms of engine performance, but it's actually noticeably better at maneuvering. So in this plane, dogfighting actually isn't always a death sentence, though it should still be avoided if at all possible. The J26 in particular is a bit unique because it only has access to the early war 50 cal belts, meaning no flamethrower tracer belt, and you just have to stick with the regular old universal belts. This does noticeably decrease the damage output of these guns, but it still gets the job done. Oh, and I should mention, this game and the next are pretty recent, as you can probably tell from the gun sounds. Unfortunately, I don't have too many nice things to say about the J26. It feels very similar in performance to the P-51D-5 in the American tech tree, which, if you've flown either of these planes before, you know the struggle of trying to put them into a position where they can actually be effective. Unlike the P-51H, the early P-51D variants do not climb at a competitive rate, meaning either you have to side climb for half the game, or you just have to accept that there will be at least a few enemies above you once you reach the battlefield. Because you aren't an effective dogfighter yourself, this forces you to play a risky game of chicken, where you try to avoid getting the attention of the enemies above you while also pouncing on targets of opportunity below you. And sometimes this ends in the entire enemy team dogpiling on you if you're unlucky. Thankfully though, there is one thing that all the Mustangs do have up their sleeve, and that's speed in a straight line. As long as you have some energy, you can outrun most of your opponents when you need to, and this also means that you can use your speed to regain altitude when the situation calls for it. As a bit of foreshadowing, keep an eye on those two XP50s up there, because they're going to be trouble later. Now, in a plane that requires a lot of speed and space to maneuver like the P-51, if you're forced into a dogfight, you do want to make sure that there's nobody else around to ruin your day while you're occupied. With a bit of patience, there is a strategy to help with these situations. When you notice an enemy with an energy advantage targeting you, fly away from the enemy team and drag them into a 1 versus 1. If you're confident in your dogfighting skills, you might not want to actually get away from them necessarily, but you just want to bait them into a patch of sky where you can have a proper 1v1 without their teammates swooping in. Sometimes this is the only way to defeat enemies that have an energy advantage, because you're basically using their own greed and confidence against them. It doesn't work every time, but it's very satisfying when it does. Other times, however, it is safer to just use the Mustang's speed to run away, especially since it doesn't maneuver too well and you might lose the dogfight anyway. And sometimes there are easier targets that you can pick on elsewhere. I'm heading back over to the city now, and in a few moments I will be engaged in a dogfight with both of those XP50s at once. And this is a great demonstration of the wonderful energy retention of the Mustang airframe. Since I don't like to talk over the action, I'll explain as much as I can right now. Both of the XP50s have such a crazy energy advantage over me that my only chance right now is to force an overshoot, but because they'll be diving at me so fast, I won't have much of a window to shoot back at all. To try to even the odds, I continually put myself into dives to increase my airspeed, so eventually I'll almost match the speed of the XP50s as they dive on me, giving me more time to shoot back, at least in theory. This doesn't really end up working, but it does drain the XP50's energy advantage so much that eventually I almost end up above them. Enjoy the show.
And victory will be ours.
And that's pretty much the end of this game. I do shoot down one more plane near the enemy runway, but it's not a very exciting kill, so let's just cut to the next one. So I didn't manage to clip the beginning of this game because it lasted for longer than the 20-minute buffer that I had running, so I hope you'll forgive this uncut. Now this is the premium Mustang Mk IA, tied with the Tech Tree P-51 original Mustang as the lowest battle rating Mustang at 3.7. This game I even got down tiered, and what resulted can only be described as bullying. The original Mustang differs from the later variants of the Mustangs in a major way. Instead of 50 cals, it has 4 Hispano Mark II 20mm cannons. That means it actually hits significantly harder, though at the expense of the guns being a bit more difficult to aim and having significantly decreased total ammunition. Overall, this Mustang might be my favorite of the bunch, because I find its performance to be the most forgiving for its battle rating. It has an even worse engine compared with the P-51D, but at 3.7 its top speed is still impressive, and the old boom and zoom tactics serve it well. Actually, maybe even better, because at a lower battle rating, you generally face less experienced players, meaning if you fly carefully, you can usually catch them off guard. The 20mm of course hit like a truck at this battle rating, and as you saw in the intro, this Mustang is actually surprisingly nimble for a Mustang airframe, meaning you actually have a decent shot at winning dogfights as long as you go in with lots of energy, which is definitely not something I can say for any of the later Mustang variants except for maybe the P-51D30. You won't see much dogfighting this game, however, because the enemy seems intent on just ignoring my existence, which is, of course, just fine by me. With that, I am out of ammo, so I have to go back and rearm. My team, however, seems to have disintegrated despite my help, so I'm getting a little worried at this point. Spoiler alert, despite my best efforts, we do not win this game. My priority now is to keep this teammate alive. Even if this P-38 can't help me take out some of these opponents in the worst case, they'll still be invaluable as a distraction so that I don't get teamed up on. Because we need every advantage we can get with the enemy having such an altitude advantage, I urge my teammate to split from me and use the airbase anti-air for additional cover while I try to engage the enemies one by one.
The enemy is winning. We must counterattack.
In the end, the strategy pays off, and we're left at a 2 versus 1 in our favor. Unfortunately, though the game goes on for another 10 minutes, this is essentially where it ends. The LA-5 pilot, after seeing my performance, decides that a dogfight would not be in their favor, so they use the LA-5FN's superior engine performance to stay out of reach until the timer runs down, and their team wins on tickets. A rather anticlimactic ending, but I suppose I kind of deserved it after airfield camping like that. In any case, I hope this video was fun to watch. It certainly was a long one. And maybe it's inspired you to get out there and give your Mustangs some love. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the skies.